Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with me tonight. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a little bit. I've been listening to my guest today for quite a while. He's appeared on a bunch of our mutual friends podcasts, Rachel Wilson, Buck Johnson, Tommy Salmons, a bunch of just absolutely fantastic people. And he's definitely had me questioning a lot of my core beliefs and a lot of things that I've kind of always taken for granted in my worldview. So I don't want to keep you guys too long in this portion of the show because I'm sure this could be a very, very good conversation. Make sure you go to all the links below where you could find my guest, myself, everything I got going on, tigerfitness.com, specifically through the link below to use my affiliate and get all their wonderful supplements. DrinkLMNT.com/in liberty and health for the world's greatest electrolytes, and foxsonscoffee.com. Make sure you use code Kyle at checkout. And without further ado, let's rock and roll. What is up, everybody? My name is Kyle Matovic. I am the host of the In Liberty and Health podcast, where we talk all things liberty, health, and wellness, and beyond. My hope is to encourage and spread the message of liberty, physical and mental well-being. I hope you enjoy all the topics we talk about with our guests. We're on all major streaming platforms, so please sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Man, I'm doing as good as anyone can do getting buried by his 13-year-old son on leg day.
I'm not going to apologize for not being on this podcast because I got to go see Metallica. So if that's a problem, kiss my ass. Okay? All right.
Welcome to the show, Jay Dyer. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Kyle. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Well, as I said in the introduction, you and a lot of different people from the Orthodox Christian worldview have really kind of got me questioning my libertarian foundations, and specifically listening to some of the debates you've done with libertarians and also the idea around like Enlightenment philosophies. But I guess before we get into that, for anybody who doesn't know you, feel free to give yourself a little introduction of what you do.
Yeah, I do a lot of breakdowns of movies, philosophy, geopolitics, debates with atheists, Muslims, Roman Catholics, Protestants. We do a lot of literary analysis. We break down a lot of big geopolitical texts from the global elite, and then I kind of summarize those in an accessible format for people. We also do a lot of comedy. I host the fourth hour of the Alex Jones Show every Friday. I've written three books.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Did you catch Cat Williams on Joe Rogan? I heard you do an impression. You do a pretty good one.
It's in my to watch list. I watched the whole Shay Cat Williams interview, and we did a couple podcasts analyzing that. But I just haven't got to the Rogan one yet, but I plan to.
Gotcha.
I was too excited for Dune to go watch that yet.
I got you. Okay, so I saw you did a whole stream on Dune. My wife and I watched it once, and I didn't quite follow it, but it seems to be a very, very big cultural thing because I see everybody talking about Dune. So I guess we could maybe start there. Why is everybody so obsessed with Dune? What's kind of the whole deal with this, and what's your kind of understanding of the meta of it?
Probably most people are obsessed with it because a lot of the culture is nerdified, and so sci-fi rules the day. But there's been 8-10 years maybe now of the outlets that would produce most of the sci-fi that people are eating up and consuming, like Marvel, Disney, right? They've been kind of like soyifying it, making it social justice woke. So I think that whenever we get just a taste of the way movies used to be before 2015, 16 or whatever, when we can, kind of reminisce over what it was like watching Lord of the Rings trilogy, in the theater, or maybe even the Matrix trilogy in the theater. People are they're craving that authentic experience where they don't feel like they're being preached at with a bunch of, woke morals and guilt trips. So that's part of it, I think. And at the same time, Dune is a unique series of novels. I read the first two, and I grew up really loving the David Lynch version, and ended up reading Dune 1 maybe 10 years ago. I really liked it, and I branched out, read the second one recently. And I think that the draw for those is that kind of like Game of Thrones. I'm not a huge Game of Thrones fan, but I think what people like about it is the complexity of the plots. There's a lot of courtly intrigue, conspiracy, espionage, all in a sci-fi novel, but also a lot of elements that you wouldn't expect in science fiction, like no AI, right? I mean, the world of Dune is unique in that they've had a a crusade of sorts at one point in the universe's history against artificial intelligence. So there's no aliens that we can think of or that we know of. So aliens, AI, the very staples of classic sci-fi are not there. And Herbert was a unique figure who doesn't fit into the traditional normie liberal sphere of science fiction like most of science fiction authors would be. He was a GOP speechwriter, and I'm not saying that makes him a good guy. The novels are not ultimately like Christian, but they have kind of basic traditional ideas about the roles of men and women. They have some perennialist ideas, which I would critique, but I think are still interesting just from a storytelling perspective. It's kind of a Nestorian view of man and God, and that, you know, the main character kind of becomes a godlike figure eventually. And this is critiqued as kind of a warning against tyrannical government. This was actually Dune Messiah makes a big point of this because it came out in the Cold War. So Herbert was interested in warning people about the dangers of Soviet autocracy. That's just one kind of element of the novel, though. But there's all these other weird, you know, really pioneering, way ahead of their time things in the novel, which comes out in the 60s. You've got geoengineering, you've got MK Ultra mind control, you've got you know, the idea, very profound, I think, that a lot of the global economy revolves around illegal resources and black markets, the spice, which is the drug of that universe. Right. So I think we're being told about that. And the Fremen are kind of a loose analogy to, you know, Islamic Arab cultures, loosely speaking. In the future that we're speaking of there, it's actually a 10,000 years into the future where there's like a blended Catholicism and Islam into some kind of weird religion. And I just like all the you know, the elements of the secret society, of the witch coven that sort of manipulates bloodlines, genetic manipulation. All these conspiracy themes are not typically and espionage themes are not typically in a science fiction novel. So it's very unique in that way. And the series itself, the books, they get really, really philosophical. And, you know, as a philosophy student, that interests me. So I could definitely understand why people, if they hadn't read the book or don't like that story, they might not like the first movie. But I think just standing on its own, you have to see, obviously, the first one to watch the new movie. But it's just an amazing technical achievement. The sound, the cinematography, the art direction just kind of blows everybody away. And we haven't seen anything like this, like I said, in 15, 20 years in terms of movie going.
Yeah, well, the one thing that kind of came to mind amongst some of the topics you were hitting on there was I thought about Avatar, because the original Avatar came out in like 2008, I want to say, somewhere around there, and then the second one came out like a year or two ago, and that kind of goes like the cinematography. Yeah, because both of those are like beautiful films with like these, you know, very, very beautifully animated world and people and all that kind of stuff. But the one other thing that I kind of thought about was when you talked about kind of like the respective roles of men and women was Jack Reacher. And that show I thought was absolutely fascinating, because it was kind of a show that displayed a masculine archetype and a figure who wasn't necessarily, you know, your typical either Homer Simpson or outright abuser, but he was doing things that were questionable, but generally, you know, you might almost recognize as good, but didn't always seem like a good idea at the time. So I thought it was a very, very interesting just 2 seasons that actually did very, very well, despite, you know, not really having any outward agenda.
Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, I haven't seen that show, but there's a few diamonds in the rough, you know, gems that I think guys like John Wick, because John Wick kind of is, you know, the remaining, you know, action hero guy from the, you know, the 90s was all about action heroes, and you've got Stallone and Schwarzenegger and, you know, Bruce Willis. And so, you know, it's I guess it's interesting that Keanu can still pull that off. But for the most part, you know, especially since 2014, 15, 16, it's just gotten really bad in terms of, especially blockbusters are so packed with propaganda, and a lot of it's the Marvel stuff. So yeah, I guess you could argue that I'm not a huge fan of Avatar myself, but I understand what you're saying just from sort of the visual experience. A lot of people find it appealing, and I think Dune is that way too. Dune 2 is that way. That you know, I didn't actually go into the movie thinking it was going to be anything other than just good and all right, like the first one. But it was way better than I expected. So I think that's why people are really gravitating towards it.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, I think we're gonna have to rewatch the first one and maybe go see the second one in movie theaters. Our mutual friend Rachel Wilson, good to see this collab. She drops by. I appreciate it, and I appreciate Rachel for all her support. So one thing that I was curious about as well is kind of your path to Orthodox Christianity, because I don't want to necessarily credit you for being responsible for the rise of Orthodox Christianity, because I see it. I don't want to say everywhere, but a decent bit now. But I definitely think you're probably one of the more well-known names. So, what was that journey like for you? Were you an atheist or an agnostic beforehand? Were you Catholic? I don't think I've ever heard you describe that, so I'm curious about how your journey on belief kind of went.
I was raised Southern Baptist, just kind of nominally. My family was from the South, and then I grew up in San Diego. My dad was in the Navy, so we didn't go to church like nonstop. We would go for a while, and then we wouldn't go, and then we would. And then I guess my high school time, I was pretty wild and didn't think anything about church or anything like that. I wouldn't say I was ever an atheist. I just wasn't really concerned with it so much at that time.
Sure.
I was more interested in chasing women and partying. And by the time I was 18, I got invited to some Bible studies that were evangelical. I went to those. So I kind of got back into my evangelical background and went to Bible college for a couple semesters. Didn't really jive with that. I was more interested in the philosophical sides of things. And so right around the same time, I started questioning Protestantism. This is about 2001, 2, 3. And so I started reading a lot of church history, and I was really interested, in the Bible. I love the Bible and, the history of the Old Testament and all that. But I didn't know a whole lot about, well, what about the church fathers and what about the ecumenical councils? And so I started hearing these things, and I didn't know much about that. So I bought the whole church fathers set, 38 volumes. I didn't read all of it, but I started with the Latin church fathers because they were the most, accessible and the ones that I had heard quoted the most as a Calvinist. So I'd heard, Augustine quoted and Ambrose and Jerome and these Western church fathers. And I liked Calvin and Luther a lot. So I wanted to see, well, okay, but what do these predecessors believe? And so that led me to a lot of questions around, well, now I realize they don't believe like I believe. So how can I say that I'm, in the same line of thinking or the same tradition as the church fathers? And so then it led to a bigger question ultimately, which was how the Bible came to be and the formation of the canon. So I read a bunch of books on that from different sides. I didn't just pick a Catholic side of it. I read Protestant, evangelical, and Catholic histories of the formation of the canon. And the more I got into the church fathers, and not just reading the church fathers directly, but also historians of ideas like Yaroslav Pelikan and his famous series, which is usually read at a lot of seminaries. So I read that series, the 5-volume series, and then I read more and more secondary works on the church fathers, more and more of the church fathers. I read a whole lot of Augustine. I got really enamored with his writings, and that led me to becoming Roman Catholic. So when I got into the Roman Catholic world in 2003, you pretty quickly are introduced to the problems of the Roman Catholic world. And I was, keep in mind, I'm like 20, 21 at the time. So I was pretty young at this time, maybe 22. And you're really idealistic when you're in your early 20s. And then you kind of study deeper and deeper into the problems of Catholic theology, and you're trying to grapple with this. And I grappled with it for maybe 7 or 8 years. And I started having my doubts about the office of the papacy. I didn't really doubt Christianity at this point. I was just kind of not sure where to go in terms of the contradictions that I saw with pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II teaching. So I went to the Latin Mass for many, many years, SSPX. And then I eventually just felt like there was no reconciliation for the open contradictions of the Vatican. I remember this is way before like the crazy stuff that Pope Francis has done. I mean, this was still, I think, in the John Paul II era. I was going to the Latin Mass, even when John Paul II was the Pope. And then we got Benedict, and people thought, oh, well, it's going to be a lot better now. And nothing really got better other than sort of externals and verbal credence to tradition. But anyway, so about 2007, I was like, I don't know if I just don't know if I believe Roman Catholicism anymore. So I had a period of like not going to church for a while. And I did start looking at Orthodoxy in 2007. And my girlfriend's sort of fiance at the time, she and I were both going to be received into the church at the same time. We went through the catechumenate, and we were going to be married and received in the Antiochian church in Nashville. And I just ultimately, when it came down to it, I couldn't do it yet. I was so wrapped up with and enmeshed in like Augustinian and Thomistic ideas about soteriology and theology. I wasn't ready for the difference that you experience in the Orthodox world. So I held off. I was like, I'm just not ready to become Orthodox yet. And that was actually the right decision. I really wasn't ready. So a lot of people were like, why didn't you should have become Orthodox? No, actually you shouldn't. If you're not really into it, you shouldn't. So looking back, it was for me the right decision not to do it at that time. So then I kind of took a break. I was burned out on religious disputes and theological debates, and I've been so enmeshed in that world for since I was 18 or 19. I just kind of got tired of it, and I didn't become agnostic. I just kind of wasn't sure about which theological tradition I was aligned with. I remember reading a lot of Neoplatonic stuff, perennialist stuff. That's when I started reading Guénon and Schuon and all these different kind of traditionalist things, which I thought were interesting, but I never really found anything that was super compelling. So I just kind of I wouldn't say I was agnostic. I still thought there had to be some kind of God. I mean, and he had to be personal. But it took about, 4 or 5 years, 6 years of that. And then I started kind of gradually reading the Bible again, reading the church fathers again. I kind of had to warm back up to it because I also had some bad experiences at the Orthodox church at that time. And so eventually I decided to keep studying it. And I had been studying it off and on. It wasn't my main focus. But ever since 2007 or 8, I was always interested in reading the Eastern Church Fathers, the Cappadocians and so forth, and St. Maximus. So I made the decision to finally convert to Orthodoxy actually in 2014, but I wasn't near enough to a church to be received yet. So it took actually about 2017 to be received and then chrismated. I call myself like a 10-year catechumen. So I was basically learning it throughout that whole period. So anyway, that's a long story, rambling, but that's my background.
No, that's fascinating because one thing that's kind of interesting for me, as I've been agnostic pretty much my entire life, but I would say over the last couple of years, especially since I met my wife, I've been more and more interested in religion. And as I've seen what it's done for other people that I know personally in their lives, it's really given me a lot to question and a lot to think about. And I like that you said you weren't quite ready and that you thought it was the right move to kind of hold off on kind of going all in on becoming Orthodox, because I think a lot of people, whether it comes to religion or really anything, the first thing they want to do is they find their new toys. They can't wait to kind of dive all in on it and say like, this is me and I identify as this. And then, it's like it's essentially the Dunning-Kruger effect where like, as soon as you learn about it, you know everything. And then like right after the first couple of months, you realize, oh, I don't know anything. And there's so much more room for growth. That kind of seems like what you were probably experiencing.
I think that's a very wise approach. Yeah. I mean, I'm assuming you're younger than me, but I mean, it took me many years to learn that. So, again, part of it's, when you're in your 20s, I'm not talking about you, but people in general,
Sure.
when you in general are in your 20s, you're very idealistic and you think, like you said, like, oh, I've, watched, at that time, we didn't really have YouTube. It's like, oh, I've read a bunch of blog articles and like, now I know, this position and I'm so convinced and certain. And I think, it just takes time to get older. And then you realize, well, nowhere is going to have like this perfect, easy. There's no position that's going to answer every question, right? That doesn't mean that there's no position that can answer anything at all or give a basis for a worldview. But I think you have really high expectations. You have these purity spiraling tendencies when you're in your 20s. And as you get older, you realize that these are kind of unrealistic expectations for any position at all, whatever your worldview is. So yeah, I think that and there was immaturities that I had in my 20s, obviously not just theological immaturities, but immaturities about my own life and, kind of being lazy and not being prepared to be married. And so there's a lot of things that also, like I shouldn't have gotten married at the same time too. So I'm glad I didn't because I wasn't ready for it. But yeah, I think you learn that as you get older, that the grass might seem greener on another position right away. And it may actually be, right? It may be greener, but we don't want to leap into those positions too hastily. And I think when you're younger, there is the temptation to fall for that.
Yeah, and I think to that point as well, with age, I feel like you probably learn that, like, regardless of the belief that you hold, like, a lot of the work is still going to be on you. And I think that's what a lot of people who don't quite take their religion seriously probably lean on, like, going to confessional and just saying, oh, well, I'm relieved of all my sins, so therefore I can fuck off for the rest of the week, and it doesn't matter what I do. But I like the way that our mutual friend Rachel kind of described it to me. Whenever people pass away and they're in the presence of God, that you're going to feel more of a warm feeling rather than, perhaps a cold or unloving feeling. And I may be paraphrasing this poorly, but, like, the idea that the accumulation of your life and the good deeds that you did is going to define the relationship with God in the afterlife. That was something that was very, very fascinating to me in the way that she'd explained it. And I'm incredibly ignorant of religion. So, like I said, this is just over the last couple of months, kind of diving into this stuff has been very, very fascinating for me. And you've definitely played a part in that, as well as Rachel, Tommy, and some of the other people that I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an attitude typically. One big difference that I think you're hitting on, and you can correct me if I misunderstood you, is that in the typical Western ideas of religion, whether it's Protestant or Roman Catholic, like the typical attitude is like God, the stern judge, and then I'm guilty. And, if I go and kind of do these religious rituals, I'll be straight. You know what I mean? I can go back to whatever. And I think the difference is that Orthodoxy is more like a rehab program, like in the sense that we're all kind of going into the situation where there's not a mechanical exchange. I mean, you could conceivably make it a mechanical exchange if that's what you chose to do. But like in my experience, it's more so like confession isn't like a mechanical exchange. It's more like a very personal situation of like having a personal trainer. So it's like literally having a personal trainer that's like keeping you accountable to whether you've made progress in virtue, as opposed to an anonymous confessional in the Roman Catholic Church where I just say these things and he says, okay, go say about 5 Hail Marys and try to do better. This is more like, internal counseling where you're figuring out the problem points and then addressing those and then kind of having accountability to see if you're getting better. So it's a lot more intimate in the sense of the confessional example that you gave. And that's, I think, a better explanation overall as to one of the differences, say, between the Orthodox experience and what you would experience in the Roman Catholic world. That's not to say that Roman Catholics aren't serious or there aren't people who are sincere about wanting to do better. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that just the experience of confession itself, as an example, contrasts these two views of a kind of a cold mechanical exchange versus a kind of personal trainer who actually kind of cares about you as an individual. Because if I'm going to confession and it's like there's the blinders there, right? And he doesn't know who I am. I don't know who it is. I mean, conceivably in the Roman Catholic world, right? You can go confess in Roman Catholic churches and they have no idea who's talking to them. So it's like cheating the system, but it's only cheating you, because the purpose of having a confessor or spiritual father is that to see, like, are you getting better? Like, do we need to do, maybe we need to do this over here. Maybe you need to spend less time, out at the bar. You need to spend less time, doing XYZ because that's an occasion for sin for you or something like that. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like rather than reporting in on a phone call to like an automated service, like, did you do your workout today? Right? Like, you've got an actual personal trainer that's there, on the spot. Like, that's a better analogy.
Yeah, no, I think you picked up exactly what I was putting down there. And I think the idea of accountability is very, very important for people because, when you have high expectations amongst your community or amongst other people, then you do innately feel like you have to do better. Like an example that always comes to mind for me is that like I work with a very, very good group of technicians. So I'm an automotive technician by trade. And I know that if I were slipping or that if I wasn't doing my best, then the rest of the guys in the shop are going to look at me and say like, hey man, come on, pick it up. Like we have a good crew of guys here. We need you to pull your weight. And essentially, I think kind of what you were getting at there is essentially that your spiritual father would be that same kind of motivating spirit in a way, saying like, okay, well, you're falling behind on these behaviors and you need to do a little bit better, but not in a way that like, oh, you're going to go to hell if you don't do better, but like you should want to do better for yourself. Am I
Yeah, I mean,
off
it's like
base
the
here?
ideal relationship. It's a mirror. It's a spiritual version of father son, right? So I mean, unless we had a particularly bad experience with our human fathers, which is possible, right? Typically, we don't. Most fathers love their sons, and so your dad doesn't want you destroyed. He wants you to do better. So that's the analogy to father son. And certainly, in the Protestant world, there are pastors who counsel people positively, and I'm not saying that doesn't occur. It's just a very different experience, I think, in the Orthodox world, because, for example, in Orthodoxy, there's a big emphasis on things like fasting and almsgiving, and so your spiritual father is going to say, combat. Like if you have a problem, I don't have a problem with gluttony per se, but let's say you had a problem with gluttony. The antidote to gluttony is not just not eating. It's actually the opposite. Every vice has a corresponding virtue. So if your temptation is to like be a glutton and you're consuming, then the antidote is to practice more giving. So rather than take, you're giving. And so there might be like, not just fasting from these foods that are, high in whatever carbohydrates and sugar. Maybe you should also find some people who are in need that could use some of that money. So maybe you're spending, I don't know, $50 extra on junk food a month. Why don't you take that $50 of junk food and find somebody who needs help with their groceries? You see what I'm saying? That might be a potential antidote. And so getting in the practice of virtue is how we acquire the virtues. And that's different than like an average, maybe Protestant pastor who they're not typically going to, even stress almsgiving unless it's like, give me more money for the church or something. Like Protestants might do something, pastors might do something like that. But it's just a very different approach to virtue and vice. Whereas in the Protestant world, it's a lot more like, ask God for forgiveness, and then like God's disposition changes towards you, and it's like, but I'm the one that needs to actually have the interchange. It's not just me paying off God or like doing something to be in His favor, like a mob boss, right? Like God's the mob boss, and you send your 20% commission up to the Godfather, then you're good. It's like, no, actually, I need the healing though. I need the inner transformation. I think that's a good analogy to the difference there.
Yeah, that's actually fascinating. Everything you said there, specifically with laying out the vice and virtues. I've never heard anybody lay it out that way, but I think that's beautiful, really, in its nature. So one thing that I also want to kind of touch on, it seems like I would say I'm kind of included in the red pill sphere right now, and um, I'm curious if you see a similar bastardization of religion in the way that people kind of talk about religion in alt media right now. By the way, like people representing it. So maybe I'm not articulating this perfectly, but like when I see people who just kind of flip over to religion right away and then want to, preach to everybody sanctimoniously and never acknowledge their own previous sins, and just kind of the way that alt media just bastardizes everything now, right? I'm sure you see this in droves, but I'm curious if like you think that's a net negative or a net positive, because like I said, I don't think it's just goes for religion, but it just seems like kind of like the current day, everything that's good, the alt media will take it, and then you're going to have dumbasses that just go out and fuck it up.
Yeah, it's a really annoying phenomenon. I'm not sure what the solution is. I personally, I tend to not pay any attention to the For You. So like,
Sure.
I tell my wife this.
You're so much smarter than me.
My wife follows, she pulls up Twitter and she gets on the For You, and then, you know, she's coming to me. So-and-so said this, so-and-so said this. And I'm like, I don't care. Don't tell me what's on the For You. I never, ever look at the For You. Now, maybe other people can handle it better. I don't. I just don't do it. So, I mean, that's not obviously going to solve this problem, but
Right.
I mean, as people are more and more, you know, deracinated in modernity, they're going to be looking more and more for answers, for authenticity, for tradition. And so they're going to be looking across the spectrum of Catholicism, classical Protestantism, Anglicanism, you know, traditionalism. They might be looking at Orthodoxy, all kinds of different things. So I think that as things get crazier, more and more people are going to continue to operate this way. I don't know how there's no answer really to stopping grifters or to stopping people who were suddenly become super self-righteous. I find it to be really annoying. People might think that I'm like a heated debate bro or whatever, but like, you don't see me preaching and going crazy on morals.
No, real quick, I wanted to touch on that real quick. Every time I've seen you debate somebody, my interpretation, because I watch your Liquid Zulu debate, I watch your one with Austin Peterson, and I watch your one with Stefan Molyneux. And I think whenever you're with somebody who's being good faith to you, I've never seen you go bad faith on anybody. I've only seen you get frustrated when it seemed warranted. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that's an honest appraisal. I think I'm a fairly reasonable person. I'm not gonna, for no reason, just be, you know, rude or an ass to somebody. You typically, you know, if that comes about, it's because people are debating in bad faith, or they're people who have been, you know, a consistent problem for many years, and then maybe somebody doesn't know that there's a background with that person being a problem troll or whatever, and they hear me saying, "Oh, I'm not going to talk to you." "Oh, you're so mean. You didn't talk to." Yeah, but that's the guy who calls in every time I do a stream. Right. And I don't, so people don't know these backgrounds and this kind of stuff. So that's part of it. But another part of it too is I'm sure you would share this sentiment. I mean, so many people are just so like sissy now. I mean, it's like they'll act like if you disagree or if you debate in a heated way, that's somehow like hurtful to them, and then it's attack on them, and it's which is not. It's just ridiculous. I mean, that's just what men do. Men debate. Men have disagreements. They can get heated. If it gets to the point where people are, you know, ready to fight, a dude, you know, dudes can step outside and like wrestle it out or whatever, you know what I mean? And let it go. But we're in this weird feminized, passive aggressive situation where people have an internet exchange with people and they hold a grudge for 5 years. And then, you know, it's just really weird. Or they, you know, the whole woke culture, like it's all based on this envy. Cancel culture really, I think, is just a technique of trying to bring other people down who are doing well. And so because you're envious, you want to get them canceled. You want to shut them down because you feel like, you know, you should have had the job or the media outlet that they have or something like that. So that's a big part of its envy, which is, again, another kind of trait of a egalitarian feminized society that's all based around security. It's based around sensitivity. It's based around how people feel as a result. And that means that we're not basing our society around logic, logos, around objective principles, around true and false, good and bad. We're basing it around how it makes me feel. And that's all very feminine when it comes to those are feminine virtues. They can be good for women to have those types of nurturing virtues. They don't work for organizing a society. And so we're in a situation where the society is intentionally being organized around those feminine qualities, which again are not in themselves bad per se, right? Women need those traits to nurture children. They're made that way. Right. But to make the nurturing of a child trait the norm for the society creates the nanny state. And the nanny state is happy to have everybody policed and controlled on the basis of irrational things like being able to cancel somebody because they hurt your feelings. Mm-hmm. And that's just insane. And that's that kind of a society it won't last. It'll collapse. And then we'll be back into some sort of brutality situation. And all of those people will be relying upon the masculine power and force, which can protect them, defend them, build the water systems, you know, engineer the bridges, etc. Right? You're going to be back to relying on the patriarchy, which is the way it should be. So yeah, I mean, there's no easy answers to how to solve the grifter problem. And I think that, like, when in my 20s, I can remember when I get pretty serious about my expressing of Christianity. It was really immature, and I was fairly new to this whole sphere of things. And I thought it was my job to, like, publicly project all of this.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a good action to do. And I think there's been some really good studies. I put a study up on this, or an article on this, on my Substack some months back. And there was a guy who was analyzing the motivations of this kind of extreme religiosity. And a lot of it stems, I think, from people's insecurities and sensitivities and psychological problems. So if you're an insecure person, and maybe even if you're insecure about your religious decisions, you might do all of this external projecting to try to soothe your own doubts and try to assure yourself that you're actually committed to this. I thought that was a really profound, just a psychology paper. I'm not saying all religion is explained only by psychological motivations. I'm just simply saying that psychological motivations can at times help us to understand why we might at times see these bizarre manifestations of people expressing extreme forms of religiosity in the public sphere, which we can say is Twitter and the internet now.
Sure.
And I think it probably comes from insecurity, envy, soy rage, all those types of things. But the grifter thing, that's maybe a different thing. That's part of it's that, but then the grifters are, there's people who are pretending to be Bayes and Trad or whatever, and they're probably not, just because they see that it's a rising trend.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I've noticed definitely over the last year, because is like with the rise of Donald Trump back in like 2016 up until now, you see a lot.
Point,
yeah, you see a lot more of like a right-wing revival, but obviously since October 7th, some of these right-wingers, you could question their values whenever they're willing to shout people down over disagreements on that little country over in the Middle East, which has been absolutely fascinating. And for me, it wasn't unpredictable at all, because I more so look at things from a human psychology standpoint, where you understand, much to your point, that people are, when it comes to their personal beliefs, they're going to double down, triple down on them sometimes whenever they're called to the carpet. I think you and I are both probably intellectually honest enough people that, a lot of positions that we hold, if called into sufficient question with sufficient evidence, would probably change our minds.
We would start doubting it, yeah.
Exactly. But I think a lot of people, when it comes to Donald Trump, is like the perfect example, where like you see the whole left half of America will say he's the worst person ever, and you can't convince them otherwise. And the whole right half of America will tell you he's the best person in the world, and you cannot tell them otherwise. It's been a fascinating thing to watch. And like, if you can just remove all your emotions and all the way you feel about Trump or Biden, you could just say, holy shit, like people are just acting in like their most base nature way, where they feel like they're fighting off their, the tiger that's on their back, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's a very perceptive analysis. My friend David Patrick Carey, he's done a lot of live streams where he talks about how there's a pattern to this, rise of dissident right, whatever we want to talk about. We had Trump coming on the scene. We had these, kind of wild versions of right-wing stuff that I think were pretty quickly co-opted, alt-right and all that. When in a Fed direction, I was always warning people against that stuff. And then we had dissident right, and then we had Peterson played a huge role, obviously, in people beginning to kind of question normie stuff. Sort of get Trump, and then right after Trump, we kind of get the rise of Peterson. Then it turns into Tate red pill stuff. So there's been this interesting series of figures who have appeared to shift the focus of the discourse. And then now we've got Elon Musk kind of coming to the fore of his role. Everybody always asks, what's their motives? I always hate this debate, because you can never figure out people's motives. Right. How will you ever know a person's motives unless you have some recording of them telling you their motives or something, right? It's just a stupid, ridiculous debate to debate people's motives. I mean, anybody can be deceiving and deceptive, deceive you on the internet. Any of these very powerful people, I'm sure, have to engage in some degree of subterfuge and concealing their real motivation. So it's just an annoying constant. I'm not saying you did this, but like people,
Right.
anytime I go on a show, they're like, what do you think of Donald Trump? What do you think of Elon Musk? And I'm so sick of that question. It's just like, I don't know their motives. You want me to tell you, like, I don't know, and I don't care about those motives because it's something I can never really know anyway. So you're asking me to, comment and give you information on topics I don't have access to. So it's like, well, what are the motivations of Xi Jinping? I don't know. He's probably not a good guy, but I mean, I don't know his motivations. So I think there's all those distracting questions which don't really matter. And then we have, people trying to find authentic Christianity and tradition, authentic religion. And you get these people, these figures who kind of spur that question, which can be a good thing, right? Obviously, I don't agree with everything Trump says or Peterson says or Tate says, but the questions that are caused and raised from those figures, then I think leads people in a lot of interesting directions. Maybe I'm just rambling at this point, but I forgot what the question was or where we were going.
No, that's okay. Basically, I noticed a lot of stuff that you said there, and like a lot of the social analysis is more useful than necessarily the figures themselves. But basically, like you just see a lot of people kind of act very, very almost religiously when it comes to political figures.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, people. I think humans are fundamentally religious. I do agree with that analysis. And that doesn't mean that you can't strive to be objective and to refine your worldview or your position based on.
It's about understanding your bias.
Yeah, I mean, I've changed my position a few times, like not zillions of times, but I was raised Baptist, got into Calvinism, then I became Roman Catholic, and then started questioning that based on information that I encountered. So, and then the changes continue on from there to eventually being Orthodox. So, yeah, I think there's I don't know what the perfect balance is to that. There is no perfect, easy answer to that. It's something that I think you have to get learned experience, learned wisdom from. It's not just a question that's solved by knowledge. I think when you're young, you think that you can solve all these problems like you're some kind of Spurg machine with more and more information and data. But you actually need the wisdom of lived experience to apply the information at the right time in the right way. So that's something that only comes with age. And not everybody gets wisdom. I see so many people today, like you're pointing out, with like the online, pretending to be righteous sphere. And I mean, to me, a lot of these people, like they come off as like obvious fakes. And so I'm like, where is there anybody? Nobody has any discernment. Nobody can discern between like, true and false, good and bad here. My light just went out. My battery died. But but yeah, and I'm not saying that people can't debate morals. I'm just saying, like, I've always found it distasteful when people take this like super hyper moral approach, as many people do on Twitter and places like that, when they're like, like you said, like you were an atheist last year and now you're like this super hyper moral. It just really, it grates on my nerves, but it's a mistake I guess we all make. I made those mistakes when I was young, but I think, yeah, so worldviews are religious. People hold them in a religious way. Most of the time people are not motivated by logic. They're motivated by emotion, psychological things. They're motivated by base desires.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Rachel
let me try to turn this light back on.
Yeah, you're good.
It's gonna get dark.
Yeah, that's all right. You still look good. Don't worry. Peterson was right about people thinking they can fix the whole world when they can't even clean their own room. To her point, yeah, I think that was a really, really good point. I think that did a lot for people. And like, it sounds so simple, and it is essentially a platitude, but I do think it's useful for people to at least consider, as the saying goes, consider the log in your own eye before you consider the speck in your neighbor's. I might be butchering that, but I think that's kind of the ethos that she's kind of getting there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that, morals is kind of just the easiest thing to go to, is to just go after, be this really annoying, preachy person. I don't know. It's just, I feel like I grew out of that in my 20s, so it's not me. Again, I'm not calling out anybody specifically. Sure. I don't even have anybody I'm thinking of in my mind. I'm just thinking of, I don't know. There's a lot of young people on Twitter that I think probably,
right.
They're new to religion or whatever, and they're kind of like, there's a tendency towards fanaticism. One thing I'm noticing, and this is my suspicion, is that a lot of what's going on the online sphere, I suspect, with all of these debates, and I'm not saying that it means any of the positions are false, just from a strategic social engineering, societal control vantage point, I suspect that a lot of different positions are being intentionally engineered towards more and more radical, more and more atomizing positions to foster and foment the debate within society. So and I agree with many of the points of, the red pill in the sense of like critiques of, feminism, critiques of problems in modern, marital situations, the no fault divorce. I agree with all that stuff.
Sure.
But I think like this one sphere, the side of the sphere I totally disagree with is like the MGTOW incel group that ends up pushing sex bots and this kind of stuff. That I think is like an intentional radicalization that parallels the intentional radicalization of the extreme feminist groups. So I see there was actually a mention, one of the NATO documents mentioned intentional fostering of trolling and internet division. It was the NATO PSYOP document. I think it's the cognitive warfare document talks about this.
Oh, that's actually fascinating. I never even heard of that. But yeah, I agree in like that end of the red pill MGTOW situation. It's like they kind of get a lot of the diagnosis right, but their prescription is just absolutely ridiculous. And I know you've engaged with Rollo and some of the other, what I would say are better red pill guys, and more of like the actual red pill guys who just kind of stick to the praxeology of things. I think those guys are kind of like the ideal, where they're not telling you how to live. They're just saying, hey, here's this information. You figure out how to live from there.
Yeah, I think, but a lot of people can't separate the two. Right. So a lot of people
they can't
get past the person. And I experienced that myself. They're like, oh, it's Jay Dyer. It's like, well, I mean, so what? Right. I mean, the information stands on its own. The arguments stand on their own, irrespective of me. I mean, that'd be like, imagine saying, well, I don't like my math teacher. So 2 + 2 isn't 4 because I don't like my math teacher's a butthole. I mean, that's just so dumb, but that's the equivalent of it's like the arguments, the information, the data stands on its own. And so there is a lot of good information in, the rational male, that kind of stuff. Been reading Rollo since probably, I don't know, 2012, 13, somewhere in there. I used to read Ruch's Return of Kings religiously for however many years he had that. So, that's a sphere that I'm familiar with. I read The Game Strauss's The Game when it came out. I read, a lot of those texts, Mystery Method. So, I'm familiar with that sphere and that whole mindset, whether it's red pill or PUA or whatever. So I think they have insights. And then I think that when people have those insights, then what happens is you get the intentional diversion of the information over into these extremes, or they just make it about the persons to deflect from the topics being discussed. And so my wife and I were having a discussion about this the other day, and she was saying, don't you think that there's the dangers in this stuff? I said, yeah, because if you think about it, I think the system knows, for example, that because we've had 150 years of feminism, the system knows there's going to be a reaction eventually to that. People are going to say, wait a minute, if we've had the feminizing of all areas of our society, if all the HR people and the CEOs and the professors and the managers are all women now, people are going to start noticing and reacting in some way. And so the initial counter reaction is, you could say, might have even begun with Paul Elam and people like the MGTOW Spearhead. I used to read Spearhead back in the day.
It was back like late 2010s, probably like 2014-ish, somewhere around there.
So then the characterization is that, oh, well, that's all this group of people, and they all believe this over here.
Judge the group by its worst members.
Yeah, and that's not accurate because this movement ended up splintering in a lot of different directions. Where I met like a guy in 2012 or 13, 14, somewhere in there. He had written a book about divorce laws in Canada because he'd been screwed over in the divorce courts in Canada. And his book was about that whole changing of the justice system in Canada to favor whatever women said, even if the women were not fit to be the guardians, right? Custodians, whatever the children. And so at that time, right, the focus was either pickup artist community or men's rights concerned with family courts. And then it's sort of like, I guess, what Cernovich puts out his documentary challenging the feminist narratives, and he had that feminist woman in there and all that. And I think that took, then the title red pill, right, became kind of like associated with, in general, anything to do with the manosphere. When in reality, the manosphere was, you know, if you read Return of Kings, you were reading stuff that was manosphere, pickup artists, philosophy, religion, economics, all of that was, it was all over the place, right? So it was pulling from a lot of different arenas. And then you had certain people, you know, Royce. I read Royce for years and years and years. You know, and he was focusing on the cathedral, the culture war, feminism in the culture. He might talk about some of the PUA points here and there, but he also talked about a lot of manosphere stuff, men's rights and all that, statistics, you know, abortion, all of the stuff, right? So it was pretty diverse. And then what happened, I think, with when the Tate sphere came to the fore and adopted the term red pill, then it became associated with the Tate sphere, and it then all became about Andrew Tate. And then it's not about the topics that are being discussed and whether the data matches up with this or that claim, right? So I was just telling Jamie that I think that the system, that there would be a counter reaction. And I'm not saying that specifically an individual. I don't have any information about any specific individual being like the catalyst or something. I'm just saying that the system's perspective, I think, is to anticipate the counter reaction. You could think of the same thing when you have communist revolution and you have what's called the counter revolutionaries. Smart, cunning people from the system will also want to co-opt the counter revolutionary movement as they control the revolutionary movement. And I think Lenin talked about controlled opposition, right? So this is a well-known thing. And it happens in this sphere as well, where they will study and try to steer and radicalize in various ways these types of counter reactions. We've seen it exactly with the right-wing movement. When Trump came to the fore, what did they do? They had this giant thing go on at Charlottesville, right? And that ended up destroying and dissipating that whole movement very effectively. We get another dissident right type of movement that occurs. Then what do we get? JSIX, right? We get that.
Right.
That effectively does a similar thing. So the system always does this, where they try to take the counter revolution, the counter reaction, and do whatever they can to either fragment it, destroy it, neutralize it, or turn it into some just lunatic thing. You know, we've had, for example, many INCEL dudes go off the hook and go crazy and go shoot up something, right? So I mean, I don't know the specifics of those cases. I'm not trying to say, oh, it was an MK Ultra. I don't know that, but I'm just saying that whether it is or isn't, like, they'll take that and say, oh, here, you know, it'll become this national news.
It's the net effect of it.
It's the national, like Elliot Rodgers, right? Wasn't he like, oh, he's like the first INCEL guy? That was
that's kind of what they pinned him down.
That's how they framed it exactly. So anyway, I guess I'm rambling, but that's an example of how movements, ideas that gain traction can be steered and neutralized.
Yeah, that's kind of the way that I see Trump's role in the 2024 election, because I mean, if you look at kind of how everything played out, I don't know how anybody can look at 2020 and still say that Trump is on the outside of everything, when really, like, there's not a lot of daylight between him and Biden when it comes to policies, other than maybe like Trump wants lower taxes and less immigration, Biden wants more taxes and more immigration. I mean, other than that, you know, when it comes to Israel, foreign policy, a great deal of many things, they're kind of lockstep on a lot of stuff. So I understand the whole deal with, oh, well, you know, the establishment hates him and everything, but really, I don't think this stuff is as meaningful as people want to make it out to be. I really think it's meant to just recycle more money into the RNC and the DNC, because Trump is the perfect boogeyman. If there's no boogeyman, nobody's going to get paid. So as long as Trump's around, the Democrats get paid, the Republicans get paid. I mean, he raised $240 million on, you know, election fraud lawsuits and then pocketed 210 million of it. So like, where's all this money going, and why are, you know, so many people flocking to Trump as his figure? I mean, if they really wanted to get rid of him, they would have Ron Paul'd him, essentially just kept him completely out of all the news and everything like that, and he would have never been a thing. But for some reason, he was just so propped up, and even, you know, Hillary Clinton said it was the Pied Piper strategy. So I know this kind of drags it back to politics, but the general theme here is that I think that a lot of this stuff, like you said, is kind of propped up artificially, so that way people still continue to buy into the, you know, the mainstream conversation and the ideas surrounding that.
Yeah, I think anytime somebody begins to speak against the defined allowable magic circle discussion topics, they immediately are reminded that you can't do that. So, you know, for example, Reagan talked about the Trilateral Commission, and Reagan got warned with a bullet, right? So similar thing has happened with other people. There's, you know, you can't, there's certain things you can't talk about. Now, I don't know if Trump was like, quote, warned. One good analysis I heard was that Trump initially was going to not take Republican RNC money, and then he would be independent. But then what happened in the first term supposedly was that the deal was that if he did take the RNC money, he would also have to make a compromise on who would be in his cabinet. And so that's, I don't know if that, I mean, that's just what I've heard from people who presumably would know that that's the main source of the problem with why things were bad, why the swamp wasn't drained in the first administration. I've never, you know, I kind of checked out of politics back in the, I mean, I will watch stuff and find it interesting, but national politics, I think, has been kind of a puppet show for a long time. I mean, I definitely think Biden is pretty terrible. So,
Right.
I mean, just even for morale and just, you know, like, I mean, even if just Trump is there symbolically, it's like, still seems like it might be better than Biden. But I mean,
Sure.
but I do understand the sort of apathy about like presidential politics. To me, it's just kind of ridiculous. And I've thought it was ridiculous since the Ron Paul sphere, like you said. I mean, I was there pro Ron Paul at the time, and I remember them, you know, like they just excluded him from everything. And that was enough to at that time to neutralize Ron Paul. So, yeah, I don't know what to say about the Trump phenomenon. I didn't really have super high expectations. So,
You know,
I think that probably Trump is just kind of a boomer on a lot of issues, like unbending on, you know, areas which just seem absurd to me. I mean, the Stabby program, it was ridiculous. His position on Bitcoin is totally boomer. I mean, I just think that there's certain issues that boomers and evangelical boomers, they will never, it's just, they're never going to get out of that. They're never going to question like premillennial Zionism if they're a boomer Christian. They're never going to question stonks and the dollar, which is fiat and worthless ultimately. Right. They're never going to conceive of what Bitcoin is. I mean, they're just, I mean, if a boomer can question JFK, that's all we can expect. That's all we can expect. I'm serious. Like, because the only things that boomers were allowed to question were like the Vietnam War, man, or UFOs, right? I mean, UFOs, JFK, and the war. That's literally all the boomers were allowed to question. And that's pretty much all they have ever questioned. So foreign policy, they're not going to question foreign. So what's the point?
Right. Okay. So one thing that I
kind of, we're just waiting for, if I make that joke, boomers will get mad, but I was going to make a cleansing joke, but it's just a joke.
No, go ahead.
Like in the next 5 to 10 years, we were making this joke on my live show. I love boomers, by the way, that are at least not evil. So I'm not hating boomers. It's just a joke. I've been making boomer jokes for 10 years. We were talking about not the great cleansing, but we were talking about so basically in 5 to 10 years, I mean, we're going to be ruled by the Gen X, man. It's the Gen X are going to
it took me a second. Yeah.
We're going to be ruled by the Gen X are our new overlords. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
so it's time to start thinking about, hey, we've at least got a little more open-mindedness with conspiracy realities, so to speak, with the Gen X than we do with any of the boomers. So
sure.
Maybe we can hope for things getting better with Gen X as our overlords.
So, well, when it comes to like Ron Paul and libertarianism, I understand a lot of more dissident right wingers and perhaps some of your frustrations with libertarians when it comes to like the egalitarian mindset and a lot of like the Enlightenment ideals. But when it comes to, let's say, more like right wing libertarians, kind of like Ron Paul, or maybe even Stefan Molyneux, who I think is pretty good. And I know you debate him. I know you and him have some disagreements, but where would be your significant areas of disagreement with them in their worldview? Because this is, like I said, this has been something that's really been racking my brain lately.
Well, I mean, I guess you could conceivably have a libertarian position that has a high place for religion, conceivably. I don't think that's necessarily not possible. I think that the typical disagreements revolve around Enlightenment ideas of universalized human nature, which you kind of already hinted at, and the idea that I wouldn't see religion as like an appendix, or religious commitments as something that are a tool for society, but rather fundamental to society. So I think the main difference I could think of right away would be my ideal scenario might be more along the lines of symphonia between church and state, rather than negative liberty minimizing the state. And there's no easy answers to any of these questions, because I'm well aware of the problems of the state having too much authority. But the Orthodox idea is symphonia. So you have, ideally what you would have is a strong state that has the ability to do certain functions. Obviously they're limited in other ways. So you have spheres of authority, and they can't step over the sphere of the religious world, which protects a lot of the rights and values of the individuals. So the state's not really the protector of anything in the spiritual domain per se, but they have a function that the spiritual domain doesn't have. So there's spheres of authority, which is very important. And that's why the traditional image of it's an eagle with two heads, and that's church and state. So it's not like the papal model would be one-headed eagle with a church and a crown, because the Pope is kind of head of state and the church. Whereas the Byzantine classic model is, and you still see this in the symbol of Russian government, is church and state. I'm not saying the Russian government is symphonia, it's not, but that's the meaning of the symbol. So the ideal that we would have is something like that. How exactly that's fleshed out in terms of, what laws are going to be in place to restrict the private public sphere. I mean, I don't have any easy answers to that. That's super complex questions. I would probably agree more with a lot of the libertarian Austrian school on those kinds of questions about the market and that kind of stuff. But main point would probably just be the role and place of the church in a society that, the Enlightenment was pretty stringent upon separating, and basically having there's a good Russian philosopher who wrote a book. His name is Papianatsev, and he wrote a book called Reflections of a Russian Statesman. And in either the second or third chapter, he has a really good analysis where he says that you think that when you have the separation of church and state, you're going to get this independence, but what you actually get is the state becomes the new church. And so he made a fascinating argument that actually the healthy functioning of a healthy state, which isn't out of control, must have this institution of the church. I've always found that to be a pretty fascinating, strong argument. There's another good critique of this position or just the state in general from these kind of Enlightenment perspectives. I think it's an essay by Otto von Habsburg. So actually some of the monarchists have written, I think, pretty good critiques of libertarianism and republicanism. Not to say I agree with every position that some Habsburg guy says, but I thought that was a good essay critiquing. I think it's called Otto von Habsburg's Critique of Republicanism would be a good essay to read. The Pabianatsev book on Reflections of a Russian Statesman is a good book, a good read. Yeah, I think another thing that happens is that you get this assumption in the libertarian perspective that just by studying praxeology, I can get to ethics and I can get to metaphysical ideas and positions, and I don't think you can. It doesn't make sense to me. It's wrong-headed. So I would say that while praxeology can definitely give us information and data, just like if I were to read, Rollo's book on praxeology of the rational male and the rational mind and all that, and how humans act, I could definitely get a lot of that data, but it's not going to give me the ability to make a value judgment. I can't get an ought from an is, right? And so studying what happens cannot tell me what ought to happen. And that's why we need the religious system then functions as the means to get the ought. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. So then I guess my follow-up question to that would be, perhaps not a question, well, no. Jordan Peterson basically lays out that, like, when it comes to atheists, that they believe as if they act as if they believe in God. Would you kind of say that's a valid statement, or would you disagree with that? And if you do, where would you depart from that?
No, I totally agree with that. That's a critique that, I've gotten it from, I think, Bahnsen, back when I was a Calvinist, when I was 18, 19, 20, I was reading Greg Bahnsen and Cornelius Van Til, and they made that argument frequently. So that's kind of an argument that's been around for a while. Maybe even you could argue Dostoevsky makes this kind of an argument. So no, I would totally agree with that.
Okay, so then I guess the next question would be, why do you think it's just the culture and the civilization around atheists that kind of keep them behaving in a rightful way? Because I'm agnostic, and like I said earlier, I've been questioning a lot of my foundations over the last couple months, and I do kind of run into the question, okay, well, why do I behave the way that I do? Because I don't have necessarily a religious grounding, although I believe religious values and religion for people is generally good. I just never had the same experience that would convince me overwhelmingly that there is a God, but I see the utility in religion. So maybe you call me a consequentialist in that respect, where I see that, like, okay, the consequence of people believing in religion is that society tends to flourish.
Right.
But once again, that doesn't feel right to say, because it's like, I don't believe in it, but I understand the consequences.
Yeah, I think you're right there that, like, that would be a pragmatic argument. I was reading this book on the CIA's approach to religion, especially during the Cold War. It's a really good book I've been covering. It's called Aaron into the Wilderness, the history of the CIA and religion. And I just finished the chapter where that guy was saying basically what you just said, that especially during the Cold War, but even prior to that, and even still, the CIA really saw the value of whatever religion in terms of the region that they were studying and wanting to maybe have a regime change or project soft power into. Religion is seen as essentially a tool that helps the society. It's the glue of a society, perhaps. It's the the moral meaning source of a society. This is all kind of stuff that Peterson would say. I think those things are observably the case. Now, whether that means that religion is false or true it's a different question, right? So again, like, psychological reports have value, but if I were to give a psychological report like, people believe in God because, this is Bertrand Russell's argument, he says people believe in God because they're weak. Well, that's a fallacy, first of all.
Sure.
So that doesn't prove it right or wrong. So the reasons that people come to believe something doesn't itself dictate or determine whether the belief is true or false. Because I might, for example, have bad motivations or bad reasons by which I believe something true, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe, you say, Jay, why do you believe 2 + 2 is 4? And I say, I do believe 2 + 2 is 4. And I believe it because Bill Cosby came to me in a dream last night and told me. Okay, that's not a good reason to believe that 2 + 2 is 4, but it's true, right? So I can have bad reasons for true beliefs. And so likewise, I might have bad psychological motivations for a belief or a disbelief, but those things have nothing to do with whether it's true or false. But it still can be relevant information to know why people are motivated to believe this thing or that thing. Anyway, so I think that it's very valuable to look at the motivations and the pragmatic utility of religion and all that. But what religion is true or false and this kind of stuff, that's a totally different question. And I don't think they're invalid questions. I think they're very valid. But yeah, I mean, so basically, the transcendental argument runs that the only way to have an objective basis or argumentation for right and wrong, for true and false, for more metaphysics, which would be things like the good and so forth, is that you need some kind of worldview which grounds those things, because those are very all-encompassing types of claims, right? So in other words, to have belief in the good, I have to have some account of the good. And to talk about the good, it's not going to just be a question of metaphysics. It's also ethical, because I'm saying that this is good and by extension, something else is bad. Good and bad are ethics. And they're also metaphysical claims. So what worldview can give an account for the possibility of making ethical, metaphysical, and epistemic claims? And so the argument runs that not every worldview can do that. So hence the Christian worldview can do that. So it actually provides the possibility for those. So I think that for me, that's the best apologetic, logical proof for God's existence. I mean, there's other people who make different types of arguments. I think the other arguments are kind of weak, but anyway, so that's kind of the basics of tag in terms of how I would go about offering an argument that provides an account for worldviews and ethics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I gotcha. Jeez. All right. Well, you've been very, very respectful of your time, Jay. I don't want to keep you too long.
Well, did I derail it? Maybe that's like you didn't want to go into tag or something. I thought
no. I just if you got more time, I'll keep going. But I don't want to.
We could go a few more minutes if you want to.
Or no. I do because there's like a million things going through my mind. But
we're just starting to get good. Like we were talking Peterson and morals and
cool. Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, no, we'll keep going then. Okay, so one thing that I never found quite compelling was when people say you get your. I don't want to sound dismissive when I say this, but this is just the way that I'm interpreting it, and you can kind of color in the lines here. When it comes to where we receive our morals from. Where Christians get their morals from is from divine command. Well, this question is incredibly loaded for me because it's like, okay, well, how do you know that the account you're getting of divine command is right? Because each person's relationship with God is going to be different, right? And then if you're going to a spiritual father, how do you know that spiritual father's correct? And do you see the kind of line of thinking that I'm going down? Like, this has always been very, very confusing for me.
Okay, well, going to one source, it doesn't follow from that's the only source. So in our worldview, we would have multiple sources, and that's not a problem because we wouldn't necessarily believe that having multiple sources entails that the multiple sources are out of accord with one another. So for example, if I'm reading my Bible on my own, and then I go to church and we have a collective, experience of the liturgy. And then I go and talk to my priest one-on-one and we're having, counseling or something like that. Like conceivable, most likely there's not going to be a contradiction between the information that's being gotten. Right.
Sure.
If I am reading my Bible, and let's say I'm a new convert and I'm reading it and I say, oh, I've noticed something that is wrong. And then I go to the priest and you are wrong because the Bible says this. Well, I mean, that can certainly happen, but Most likely, probably, because if somebody's a new convert, they're probably not right. They're probably,
Sure.
I mean, the person who's been studying it and knowing it for a long time is probably more correct. But in my experience, this can happen, but I've not run into situations where, there was some like big existential dilemma over which authority was right. But I guess that, that's more of a lived experience that you would have to kind of see firsthand before you could really, because that's not going to translate to you. You haven't experienced that. So you don't know if that's the case. Maybe it isn't the case.
Gotcha.
And you might who knows, there could be a situation where you happen to go experience a priest who's really bad, or, maybe you find some corrupt priest or something like that. So, anything is possible, but no, I think out of hand, I would say that, well, typically it's not the case that multiple authorities are necessarily going to be out of accord with one another. And even though that might arise in some cases, even in some situations where you have an authority that conflicts with another authority, eventually there would be presumably some means to let's say you had, like in the Orthodox Church, the normal praxis of these kinds of issues is called the synod. So there's a council. And so if something was serious enough that it couldn't be resolved, then it would kind of go up the chain to the bishop and then maybe to the synod or something like that. So if there was some serious issue like that, there's at least measures in place to deal with those types of problems. Does that make sense?
Okay. So basically, I don't want to say use consensus of bishops. So basically, you would go up the hierarchy until you find the final authority who would be interpreted as the person who would be the best at interpreting the text and the perception of whatever scripture or whatever divine command that you're trying to understand at the time. I'm sorry if I completely butchered that, but does that make sense?
Well, let me put it this way. So when maybe I'm confused about, because somebody says divine command, they might think that means that when I'm reading the Bible and it says, like Jesus told his followers to go sell their cloak and buy a sword. Oh, Jesus is commanding me right now because that was a divine command that I go and sell my cloak and buy a sword, right? Like nobody that I know would hold to that.
You don't take all Bible passages literally.
Well, it's not even a question of literal versus figurative. That's actually just a question of context, because the context is speaking to a specific command to the apostles at that time, because he didn't want anything impeding his mission at that time. So, but that's not a standing command, as we would say. Like, for example, the 10 Commandments reflect God's moral law. So the moral law doesn't change, not just because it's the 10 Commandments, but we think the 10 Commandments are kind of a reflection of God's own character. So there's not going to be like any divine command that comes to us or to anyone that contradicts the existing structure of the 10 Commandments and the moral law. In other words, God's not going to, for example, command me to, I don't know, like I had a dream last night and God told me in my dream to murder my neighbor because they're, I don't know, engaging in something evil. It doesn't work like I don't have God is not going to tell me to do something that contradicts prior revelation. And there's no priest or anyone in the world that would tell you, yes, you must listen to that. That's God speaking to you. Everyone would say that's not God speaking to you, because we first and foremost, I think, believe in an internal consistency and coherence.
Okay. All right. So then,
is there another example that maybe I'm misinterpreting? Like, what's the example that you're thinking? Like, what's a scenario that you're thinking of?
It was just when I hear people say, well, we get our morals from divine command. It's like, okay, well, how is this supposed to be interpreted? That's what's always kind of confused me. And, to preface it again, I'm just incredibly ignorant of religion as a whole. So this has always been something that I've wanted to learn more and more about. Well, I think you've laid a good account for it. And I'm definitely grabbing it more.
So usually divine command is raised in the context, if it's like an atheistic objection, it's usually raised in the context of the Euthyphro dilemma, which is, should we believe in the moral command because the God said it, or do the gods say it because it's the good? So it's like, is it the gods that arbitrarily sort of determine the good, or do the gods submit to a higher ultimate standard of the good? So that is always cast out in terms of Greek metaphysics. And for us, we don't believe in Greek metaphysics. So for example, God doesn't arbitrarily say this is good this day, and in 10 years I shall decree suddenly that this is now evil, and flip them. We don't believe that it ever occurs that way, for one, because Paul says it's impossible for God to lie. So God can't go against his own nature, and anything that has a nature, in our view, can't go against that nature in terms of like suddenly not being that nature, right? So humans can never not be human. God could never not be who he is as God, and so he's never going to give a command that would contradict his own commands or his own ways of operating. So now there's certain things that God can do that humans can't do. So it doesn't mean that God does everything the exact same way that we do things. But we would say that the Euthyphro dilemma is based on a different metaphysic than the Christian has. And it's neither divine command theory, nor does God submit to some higher idea of the good.
Okay, so when it comes to kind of getting more principles, you would have the 10 Commandments, and your understanding of those would basically be consistent because you believe that God wouldn't lie. Do I got that about right?
Well, I was just saying, if we're looking for a basic moral framework, the 10 Commandments are kind of our basic sort of beginning example of a moral framework. And yeah, I mean, the reason that those principles don't change is because God doesn't change, is the way I would say it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, because this has been something else when it comes to like talking about red pill topics. Our mutual friend Tommy Salmons had said that, like, oh, well, you guys don't ever touch, what's more metaphysical stuff. And my hold up with that is that essentially it's like, okay, well, whose metaphysics are you kind of appealing to? Because like the way that people of Islamic faith, or maybe Catholic faith or Orthodox faith, the way that they kind of interpret those metaphysics and the way that they're going to navigate the world with that is going to be different. So like the way that I may view things that are immaterial is going to be completely different than somebody who believes something different than me. Am I making sense?
I wouldn't say
out of
like in certain metaphysical principles, like, are there immaterial realities? Does an immaterial reality, is it something not extended in space and time? I mean, I don't think in those specific examples of like basic metaphysical ideas, I don't think we would disagree with a Roman Catholic or even a Muslim. I mean, there are significant, huge disagreements between mainly us and Muslims, maybe less, but still significant disagreements between us and a Roman Catholic. But I think it kind of depends on which specific metaphysical thing we're talking about, because, if I'm talking to Roman Catholic, we believe that there is causation. We believe there's teleology, or purpose in the world. We believe in, universals. We believe in laws of logic. We believe in we believe in a lot of the same, because for one, not only do we have a biblical heritage that's similar, and the first 1,000 years of Christianity between us and Roman Catholic, we also share a lot of ideas from Plato and Aristotle. So, for example, Aristotle's ethics, has been very influential on the Christian tradition, and we would say that we have a version of virtue ethics, a la Aristotle. So there's a lot of commonality with things like Aristotle, but at the same time, significant differences. But the specific things that you listed, the immateriality of the soul, we would agree with. Angels, demons, I think we would agree with those basic ideas.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay, so then I guess the next question that I've always had, and I don't think I've ever got a sufficient answer for, is what would make, let's say, so you're an Orthodox Christian, what would make you believe that your religion is the one right one? And I'm not necessarily saying that you're 100% certain that it is. Maybe you are, but I don't know. Why would, Roman Catholicism or any of the other religions be wrong denominations compared to the one that you've settled with? Is it just like the matter of, how you studied it and the historical precedent for it? Or what would be kind of like your reasoning for being Orthodox versus everything else, and you believing that that's the highest truth?
So I think certain arguments could be made that fit every possible worldview. That would be like a philosophical approach to the basic epistemic, metaphysical, and ethical questions. I could do a critique of the Roman Catholic Church on those three branches of philosophy, type view.
Sure.
I could also do a critique of the Roman Catholic position in terms of the shared first 1,000-year heritage that we have with Roman Catholics. And I would say, you know, things like if we look at the 7 ecumenical councils, each of those councils has canons, which is church law or canon law, that they passed and promoted and held to, that don't comport with the Vatican I definition of papal infallibility. The changes in the Roman Catholic Church from the time of Vatican I to post-Vatican II are pretty easy signifiers also that we could look at. So these would be more historical arguments.
Sure.
And then I think you could even, you know, depending upon what Roman Catholic I was talking to, I mean, we could go to biblical argumentation as well. So there's a lot of different avenues that one could make that kind of an argument. But one commonality is that we see a lot of similar approaches, for example, amongst Muslims, libertarians, and I could use Stefan Molyneux, Azrar Rashid, atheists, Thomists. They all have the exact same starting point of natural law, and to translate that into religion, that's natural theology. And I would out of a hand argue that all of those fall apart. So all the same critiques that you've seen, I don't know if you've seen the Muslim debates, but what's interesting is that the exact same argument that came about with Stefan Molyneux came about with Sheikh Azrar Rashid, which was that, well, there's just self-evident principles. Okay, well, what are those? How do we account for those? Oh, well, they just are. So there's a commonality here that, and this is interesting, that came out of the last Muslim debate. Some of the Muslim philosophers actually anticipated the Enlightenment philosophers. And that's, I think, the commonality, which I didn't even know this until fairly recently, last few years of doing these Muslim debates. Like I knew about a lot of critiques of Enlightenment philosophy and epistemology, but I didn't expect to find this as a commonality between Muslims, libertarians, Enlightenment philosophers, and atheists.
So basically your critique of all of them would be that they kind of start with natural law as a given and kind of work from there. And you believe that divine command would take place before that?
Well, you keep saying divine command, and so I'm not sure. Do you mean just the idea of revelation, or do you mean divine command theory of ethics?
Divine command theory of ethics.
Okay.
I apologize. Yeah.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm just trying to be precise so I don't reply to something that you don't mean.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that, the argument would be that any position that tries to posit self-evidence it's a problem. And so that this is called a classical foundationalism is the epistemic position. And that's the position that everybody shares here, where we're kind of just using classic and medieval notions of first principles. So, but the problem is that post-human Kant, the world begins to question first principles. So it's actually the Enlightenment that questions some of the Enlightenment arguments. And then it puts us in this position of a lot of skepticism and postmodernity. So the question is, well, okay, so the Enlightenment is trying to get away from superstitions. It's trying to cleanse our worldviews from not having certitude and not having knowledge, right? Because Descartes kicks a lot of this off, seeking indubitable certitude. And then we get Kant and Hume and Locke taking the questions to a next level of, well, indubitable certitude is probably not going to be had through rationalism of Descartes. So it's probably going to be had, if we can have it, through something relating to empirical sense data. So we get this shift away from rationalism to empiricism with Hume, Locke, Berkeley, Kant, and pretty much everybody after that, unless they're like weirdos like Hegel or something, or Heidegger. But most of the time in the West, this empiricism comes to dominate, and eventually empiricism deconstructs itself, because we don't really have to go much further than David Hume. The questions haven't really changed since David Hume, even up until Quine. And the questions are just, well, how do we actually have a way to justify even these basic principles or first principles of natural science or sense data? Hume was consistent enough to say we can't. There's no justification. And so they're in the same category as religious beliefs. So the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity over time. I mean, David Hume is saying that if you're an atheist, skeptic, whatever, like those are in the same boat as the religious guy you're making fun of. So you're talking about the guy who's an idiot for believing in God. You're just as much an idiot for believing that you can give a rational epistemic justification for your first principles without contradicting being a circle. So this leads to people then kind of positing different ways of accounting for first principles, namely transcendental argumentation, or admitting that there is a circularity for first principles or for basic principles. This is the points that Wittgenstein is bringing up about word games. Really, he's just making the point that language is kind of circular. You can never get out of a kind of basic fundamental circularity. And that would mean then that all of the self-evidence arguments and the belief in self-evidence and first principles, that it doesn't exist. It's a fiction. So if that's the case, then that right there cuts out any religious position that would build their foundations on classical foundationalism.
Okay. All right, man, that is a lot. See, I've never had to question this kind of stuff, so I'm coming to it as.
Well, here's the thing: like if you get a book, like a mainline readable epistemology book, like for example, there's a really good one called Epistemology by W.J. Wood, and it's not that long. I recommend it to people in the audience because there's a whole chapter where he raises the very questions that you hear me talking about, and it's the chapter on classical foundationalism, and he says, well, you know, every classical foundationalist is some kind of evidentialist. And the problem with having this view of, well, there's just some things that are self-evident is that says who? You become another kind of arbitrary religious authority, right?
Sure.
And maybe it is the case that the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, excluded middle, maybe all these things are self-evident, but why should we think that that's self-evident? And then you get this problem of self-reliance where it's like, well, if they're self-evident, they can't rely on something else. But as soon as you try to give reasons for why it's self-evident, you're appealing to something else. It's no longer self-evident. Then there's another problem that's called the Chisholm problem, the criterion problem. And this is a philosopher who raised the point that, well, even if you could lay out the 10 things that you think are self-evident, you've overlooked the fact that if there's 10 things that are self-evident and there's a million things that aren't self-evident, that are derived from this, then you have a more fundamental notion of the criteria, which is the thing that allows you to adjudicate between these two things. And so, now you've got something more fundamental than your 10 things that are self-evident. Therefore, they're no longer self-evident. So these are pretty well known. I'm not knocking you, but I'm just saying, like, maybe if people aren't familiar with these questions, like anybody who takes an epistemology class, you're going to have a textbook that will raise these questions. And these questions are not just irrelevant. They're raised and they're brought up because as the discourse happens in Western philosophy, by the time you get to Quine and Nelson Goodman, they restate the problems of Hume and say, we haven't moved beyond Hume. And Quine goes so far as to say that really there is no epistemology. It's done. It's just like, we're just doing psychology now. Well, if we're just doing psychology now, then we're done with philosophy. And that's essentially what Quine says.
So when it comes to things that are self-evident, and the problem with that, I never really thought of it as a way of that, like, if you as an individual are deciding if things are self-evident because, like, hey, I can touch this remote right here, I can rely that it's going to be here over time, and like it's not changing shape in my hand. The question then is like, okay, well, why should I? What's the grounding for that belief for atheists then? Because, like, you know, you can't reliably say that it's always going to be there, but it almost seems like the religious argument, I don't say is a cop-out to just say, okay, well, God accounts for that, but that's essentially what I'm getting. Am I missing
well, the argument
anything?
is not just God accounts for that. The argument is that there are structures in place that are not God, but transcendental categories that have to be there in place in reality in an external world. And the only way to account for all of those things together is God and the Christian worldview. So it ends up being what's called divine conceptualism, which is the idea that reality is grounded not just in the things themselves, but in something beyond physical reality, in the divine mind. And the reason that it has to be a divine, personal, intentional mind is that that's the only kind of thing, the only kind of being that could do the grounding work in an epistemic sense to ground the things that we're talking about, the categories, as well as the particulars, the universals, et cetera, all of those things. And when you study what categories are and so forth, you realize they don't like, there's not like things that they're not structures that stand on their own, right? Like knowledge presupposes a knower, a self. Okay. That presupposes an external world. The ability to know things in the external world presupposes causation. And so the question that you just raised about like the external world and the object in my hand, this is a very, that very assumption is questioned in a really famous book by Sellards, Myth of the Given. And the point of that little book is that it's a famous book in philosophy because he's critiquing the idea that there's this immediate givenness of a causal experience that this object in my hand is transmitting causally information to my senses and to my brain. Now, maybe it is, but you haven't proven or shown that empirically. You've assumed it in your interpretation of the object, you see. So the point is that it's really impossible to get away from assuming things, even in something as simple as perception of a mundane object. Does that make sense? And so Sellers isn't arguing that Wilson, I guess we're all skeptics. He's just pointing out that it's not adequate to assume that because there's sense data that I'm getting reliable, meaningful information about the object as I think it's so constituted. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. So I guess the next question then would be like, how do you reliably account for consciousness amongst other people then? And what's to say that like my interpretation of this remote would be different than, let's say, my wife in the other room's interpretation of the remote?
Well, but you see, the point is that if the worldview, and I'm not saying it's true because I'm saying this, it's a hypothetical. Sure. If the worldview that's posited by the Christian system is true, and let's say we're made in the image of God, we have minds, we have the ability to reason in a discursive way, reasoning logos, which is this idea that penetrates the universe. It makes sense because it's a rational universe created by a rational being with purpose, telos, intentionality. There's structure, there's order, there's regularity in nature, which solves the problem of identity over time and the problem of induction that Hume brings up. So in other words, a lot of these really difficult problems in philosophy that have, especially in the last 500 years, made the philosophers say, we're done, we give up. They've literally thrown up their hands. A lot of those problems aren't problems in the Christian worldview because the Christian worldview gives us that logical structure and framework. The non-Christian worldview in, say, secular academia, they can't even tell you if there's an external world. That's what I'm trying to say. Like they can't get past, because remember, everything is starting with just the presupposition of an individual finite human knower and the empirical sense data supposedly that maybe is out there. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just a projection of my mind. Maybe maybe it's just solipsism. So in other words, it can't even get off the ground is the point. Whereas at least in the Christian perspective, it's not saying that you have a worldview that gives you an answer to every question. It's a worldview that gives you the possibility of how there's knowledge at all. Does that make sense? That's the actual argument. A lot of people miss that, but that's
I'm following, but the one thing that I guess I'm kind of hung up on here is that it almost sounds like you're saying, well, the religious worldview accounts for most of these things, so therefore it is the most likely explanation, but that doesn't necessarily, and maybe this is just because I don't get it, but
it's not a question of likelihood. The argument runs that it's the only way that all of the transcendental categories, which are all necessary for the possibility of knowledge, hold and stand together and make knowledge possible. So it's a pre-knowledge type of argument. It's a precondition argument. It's not an argument saying that the world exists, therefore God exists. It's saying that for the possibility of knowledge at all, God would have to exist. So it's a much stronger claim than just the claim that, well, maybe God fits into this, gap system or something like that.
Sure. Okay, so I guess what I'm not following is that I don't understand how all of that concludes that God is real. Like, and I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's not clicking for me.
If knowledge, the argument is that if knowledge is possible, it seems that it is, then it requires this metaphysic, and that metaphysic requires this God, a specific type of God.
Mhm.
That's the argument. So you could conceivably say, well, I don't believe knowledge is possible, but then you just made a knowledge claim. so it seems pretty, it seems pretty dead end to go in that direction. So, but the argument is that, well, if knowledge is possible, knowledge isn't possible on any random type of world. It's only possible on a certain kind of world with a certain type of metaphysic and a certain epistemology, and by extension, ethic as well.
Okay. All right. I want to make sure I ask.
Let me rephrase it like this. Like,
okay,
are you familiar with, say, Aristotle's categories?
Not off the top of my head, but maybe if you jog.
So basically, like Aristotle gives this list of categories, and these are the categories of how it's possible to know the world. Okay, so like things have to be in a certain location. They have to have a certain quantity. They have to have certain qualities. They have to have certain relations to other objects, right?
This is appealing to sense data, right? Like,
Aristotle isn't asking those kinds of questions yet, because he just assumes that, yeah, of course we have information from sense data, right? So he just takes it as a given that we have these sense data knowledge. We have this knowledge from sense data that's made possible by these metaphysical principles. Okay, so I'm just trying to give examples of what kinds of things we're talking about here, right? And I think we could also include things that are necessary for predication and knowledge, like laws of logic, like linguistic meaning, universals, particulars. Right? These are all metaphysical things that I'm saying, if we want to say that we have knowledge, and by knowledge I mean justified true belief, if we want to say we have that, then the world's got to be a certain way. So, for example, well, what if it's not? What if the world is a projection of my mind? Well, if I went in that direction, I could not have knowledge anymore. It would be a self-defeating belief at a presuppositional fundamental level, because if I come to the view that everything is a projection of my mind, then kind of everything's a sort of an illusion, right? And if everything is illusory or just a projection of my mind, there's nothing to compare against the false, right? I don't have a true to measure the false, because everything just is.
Right. So right there, you would be essentially the religious figure dictating reality.
Well, but aside,
if that was true.
Well, but yeah, but not just that. It would be that knowledge is impossible, because if everything that's occurring is an illusion or just a projection of my subconscious, then it's not really real. I don't have any real to measure the false against. Then what that means is that even my coming to know that all reality is a projection of my mind, that's also part of the projection, you see. And I can't know that that's real. So solipsism, what I'm saying is that solipsism is an example of a position, a worldview that is self-defeating, that actually makes knowledge impossible. And when I say knowledge, I'm talking about criteria that meets the standards, a belief that meets the standard of justified true belief in the classical sense. So I would affirm like a classical idea of knowledge is not just mere opinion, but the ability to justify, give an account for, and ground your beliefs, justified true belief. So, and we say that because I gave this example earlier in our discussion where we were talking about good beliefs versus, or good reasons to believe versus bad reasons. So this is this is, you know, like Bill Cosby saying 2 + 2 is 4 in a dream, even though it might be true. It's not a good reason to believe 2 + 2 is 4. I need better reasoning than that. And so, to get back to the tag point, the argument for God, I'm just using the solipsis as a position as an example of how maybe I don't think that there's an external world. Well, if I don't think there's an external world, I'm immediately put in this box of solipsism, canceling out the possibility of knowledge. And so the transcendental argument runs that most of those kind of fundamental moves away from a Christian or a theistic paradigm will put you in a kind of box like that. Let's say I believe, there is an external world, but everything is pure matter. Well, if everything is pure matter, then I would fall into the deterministic fallacy, which would make the naturalistic fallacy, which would make knowledge impossible. Or I would not be able to predicate and make sentences because I don't know that what I'm predicating actually applies to any meaningful thing in the world. Because if it's all just matter in motion, then distinctions between matter and motion ultimately end up being kind of illusory because it's all just atoms anyway. So there's not really anything that makes the cow different from the man, different from the truck, different from the dog. It's just matter and motion. So there's not really essences. There's no natures. And if there are no essences and natures, then language and predication now becomes impossible.
Okay. So, and that would be because each of those things you mentioned have distinctions and things that make them, distinctly them. So like, obviously I'm myself because you could see who I am, you can hear me, you can, feel me, smell me, whatever. But like, when it comes to like a cow or a dog or something like that, like they have all distinct things, natures, behaviors that you would recognize as like, okay, well, cow, grazes and, is made up of meat, ribeye, whatever. And a dog is, going to have certain things that it does and natures, which would need, I completely lost my.
Well, we need universals. We need real categories
right.
that make those things and not other things.
Mm-hmm.
And so any position that denies, for example, the reality of essences and natures is going to be in the same boxes of Humean skepticism and eventually kind of the inability to predicate. You will reduce to psychologism. So, and that's why Hume's such a great philosopher for us, ironically. Even though I don't agree with his conclusions, his point is that if we're going to go the route of denying the metaphysics, which denying universals would lead to this, then things don't really have anything in common beyond what we perceive them to be in common. They don't actually possess those things in themselves, because what I perceive to be something common is just a thing I come up with in my mind. It's a psychologized linguistic token thing. It's not an actual thing that's possessed in the being, right? Between two dogs. The dogs don't have dogness in if you were to be consistent here, if you're an empiricist, because you're not empirically seeing dogness. You're just seeing a bunch of traits that this one has, a bunch of traits that this one has, and you're just assuming that they have some shared traits. But that's the thing in question. What is the shared trait? Well, you don't believe in essences, so what's shared? Exactly. There's nothing shared. You can't consistently believe. And so that's why, as this debate progresses, if you're a nominalist, and pretty much every empiricist is a nominalist, there might be some weirdo out there that's not, but usually those, like 99% of the time, those go together. There's not a real thing that's shared. It's just appearances. It's just traits. It's begging the question to say, well, then what is it that makes a dog a dog? Does that make sense?
A little bit, but so you couldn't appeal to like dogs have specific behaviors. Like you might have heard my dog just run down the stairs and bark.
Yeah, but the behaviors are another feature of empirical sense data. So it's no different than saying that it's the dog. They have four legs. I mean, it doesn't, like, the behaviors are another piece of sense data that don't tell you if there's two different natures, because there are no natures. There's just atoms. I mean, if you're an empiricist, all you have is the sense data, and you're assuming that there's these things that are called dogs and these things that are called men, but those are just human, and they're social constructs. So Hume is more consistent here in saying that's an interpretation from a human being that you're calling. Those are English words,
right?
Okay, so there's no what's a dog behavior? I don't know, bone biting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, humans can bite a bone. So are we dogs if we have that behavior? I mean, what's the specific behavior? And in other words, you can't reduce a nature to a trait or behavior. Mm-hmm. And again, it's kind of begging the question, because the question isn't, can you think of a different thing that's not four legs or hair or whatever? Mm-hmm. Because they're all going to be sense data. So it doesn't matter which sense data trait you pick out. Hume's point is that what you're referring to linguistically is not in the thing itself. There's no, that's not in that dog. That's a human social construct.
So basically, when we conceive of something, we have the different categories that may not all be physical things that we can achieve through sense data, that we kind of abstract and say, okay, well, I know this is a dog because it looks like a dog, it feels like a dog, sounds like a dog, but it also has these other behaviors that we can't necessarily touch, taste, or feel, that we know makes it a dog. Same way, same way with people and categories from there on.
Well, you lose the ability to actually posit classes, is what I'm trying to say. Now you can do it, but there's not an account for it, right? So there's plenty of atheist materialist philosophers out there who believe in a species and who believe in a class of things. But Hume's point is that there's no rational justification for believing in those classes. It's arbitrary if we're an empiricist.
Okay. So then, okay, I hate to do this again to you, but how would it be not arbitrary when you install religion into the picture?
Well, we're not empiricists, so we wouldn't start our assumption of how we have knowledge or limit our knowledge to immediate sense data, right? Okay. So the first thing we would not agree with is that all knowledge comes from sense data. Secondly, we would not believe that knowledge is limited to sense data. And we would posit the necessity of the metaphysics that Hume and the Enlightenment rejected. There must be telos in the world. There must be causation in the world. But the Enlightenment is posited on you don't actually perceive in your senses cause and effect. So Hume's example is, to go along with what we're talking about with the dogs and the perceiving of the essences or the natures. If you think of a billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, right? A billiard ball A hits billiard ball B, and then the next one moves, right? Do you actually perceive causation there? And Hume's point is that if we're going to be consistent empiricists, no. You observe event A and event B, and you're calling that causation. But in that particular instance, you have not observed a universal causation event. So you see that there's a mistake from jumping from the particular to the assumption, which is not justified on an empirical basis, that there is a universal principle of causation. So Hume is not arguing in this that he doesn't believe in cause and effect. His point is that there's not a logical justification if you're an empiricist for cause and effect. And if that's the case, then there's not a logical justification for any of the principles that an atheist, rationalist, materialist, whatever, empiricist has. You can't justify the laws of logic, the external world, identity over time, on and on. Causation. They're just as arbitrary as somebody positing a God. Does that make sense?
Yes, sort of. So when it comes to the billiard ball example, if you hit the billiard ball, then you know that gravity is going to maintain the ball staying on the table and then hitting the other one, and when they make contact.
Yeah, but you're missing the locus of Hume's critique. Because to appeal to something like gravity or some other force or principle at work in physics or whatever is begging the question, because it's just moving to another piece of empirical data. And the point is that you don't actually know that that is a universal principle or thing going on in the universe unless you've had universal experience. So remember, if you're an empiricist, all you know is sense data. On what basis of sense data do you know that there's a universal principle of gravity?
By your, I don't want to say lived experience, but essentially that's all you can really rely on.
That's the circle, right? So you can't go from, you can't justify sense data on the principle of sense data.
Right.
So to make it really simple, I mean, the basic starting point of empiricism is that all knowledge comes through sense data. Okay. Does that principle itself, do you see that anywhere in sense data?
No.
Then it's self-refuting. That's the point.
Okay, so basically okay. Now I'm getting, so because you can't actually visually see a cause and effect, like the actual what cause and effect means, then that requires abstraction, which if you're an empiricist, you can't believe because it's not a physical thing. And the same deal with like rights.
Partly, but it has to do with universals and predication, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, you're partly right there. I would agree with the abstraction point that you're not really meaningful. We don't know that we're meaningfully saying anything about the external world. Beyond that, yeah, there's also this idea that all knowledge comes from sense data. So that all is a universal quantifier, meaning that it's a universal claim. It's a statement about all possible affairs, right? But as an empiricist, you don't have access to that.
Okay.
So
All
it's an
right,
unjustified move. Maybe it's the case, but we don't know that we can go there just arbitrarily by saying that, well, all knowledge comes from cis data. Oh, really? How do you know that? You're an empiricist. Have you universally observed that all knowledge? No, it's unknowable.
okay, yes. Okay, so now that's starting to click. So basically, like, I can't know that universally all these guitar picks all over the world look exactly the same and do the same function because I haven't seen all the guitar picks that are all over the world.
Right, but yeah, but it would be for any sentence or any class of things, you couldn't make those statements justifiably. You can make the statements, they just can't be justified.
But you can't prove it because that would require you to see every single guitar pick that's ever been made and ever will be made.
Right, and so but it's a problem not just for specific universal claims and formal propositions or whatever. It's a problem for predication in general, because it also means I can't knowably or I can't coherently class anything together as if it's a real class of things. And that becomes a problem in language because language relies on predicates, predication, right? Jay is a man, Kyle is a man. We are both members of man. There's not a thing called man. That's not a real thing. There's not a justification for this class of things. So this is the end result of nominalism, which is Hume is 100% a nominalist, and most empiricists are nominalists. But I mean, you could say, okay, Berkeley's not, but nobody believes that worldview, so it's not relevant. So what this means, though, is that it's not just a problem for language and predication, because once we do that, guess what else goes out the window? Mathematics, universal laws, like all of these things, they're out the window. And these are all just some of the examples of problems with reductionist, materialist worldviews. Reductionist, materialist worldviews.
Okay, all right. Jeez.
So if you saw if you saw the Stefan debate, for example, I was kind of making the same point, but with math, talking about 7 and coconuts. That's the point.
Okay, I remember that. Yeah,
that's the point. Yeah.
Okay. Jeez. Yeah, I've never had to think about stuff this deep, so it's a lot to take in.
Well, every atheist, agnostic person should read David Hume, and the reason they should read David Hume is that he's the consistent skeptic. And what happens when you really get Hume's argumentation is that we realize that, well, if I'm going to take this worldview, I don't really have a basis to argue, because argumentation presupposes logic, and logic can't just be matter,
because you don't
a real law.
You're appealing to a metaphysic because it's not a physical thing that you could touch, taste, or feel.
Correct. I'm arguing that it has to be the case, because if we reduce, logic's gone. There's no way to say that logic is matter. It's nonsense. Okay. Like what atoms make up the law of non-contradiction? It's just nonsense.
Okay, so then how does religion account for logic?
Well, first of all, religion is not built on the premise that everything is reducible to matter. So religion is fundamentally not a materialist position. So religion, I would say every religion I could think of, believes in some notion of the transcendence.
Yes.
So, when we talk about the transcendent, we don't just mean God. We also mean things like universals, abstract categories, mathematical entities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a great documentary I'll send you, for example, that kind of illustrates this point on Mandelbrot sets. And one of the things about Mandelbrot sets that's fascinating to illustrate this point is that we couldn't really demonstrate a Mandelbrot set until computers got to a certain level of sophistication to processing power to show like how intricate they are. But they were posited prior to the computers. But then once the computers could zoom in at certain depths, then we were able to see the mathematical principles at work, which are consistent, just absolutely insane sequences of patterns with regularity that cannot be. The human mind can't do it. In other words, so what that shows is that these are mathematical principles that are discovered, not created. And that means that probably the other ones were discovered. They weren't made up as human social constructs, right? So the laws of logic are not human social constructs; they're discoveries, and that runs counter to materialism.
Okay, now I get. I'm getting it. It's, yeah, I've never heard it explained like that. You said it's very, very fascinating. All right, so you recommended I read David Hume. That's the name, right?
Hume. Yeah, Hume's good, and his philosophy is fairly accessible. Like, it's not super difficult. I'm not saying you're dumb, but just I'm saying, like, for people that are not really familiar with philosophy, and I'm not trying to make you a Humean skeptic. I'm just pointing out that Hume's point is that if we're going to be consistent atheist empiricists, and he was, his point is we can't give a rational justification for logic, induction, the external world, identity over time, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
If you're just interested in epistemology, the book by Epistemology by W.J. Wood is good. If you're interested in the topic of Mandelbrot sets and what I'm talking about, there's a good book by a guy. I don't know what, but it's just along the lines of kind of mathematics pointing to God. It's called Mind of God by Paul Davies. That's a good book. Those might be some books you find interesting, and I'll send you that Mandelbrot documentary, which is pretty cool.
Okay, cool. Well, then perhaps we should wrap on your recommendations for your worldview. I got, what would be like 3 books? Because I have an Audible credit coming up here soon. I know you're not supposed to listen to audiobooks, but I'll probably buy a few more books because this stuff has become incredibly fascinating to me. Jay, you are probably one of the smartest people I've ever talked to. And I've just never
there's plenty of people way smarter than me, so.
Well, on this podcast in almost 300 episodes, I've had a lot of great people on, and I definitely got to say you're probably one of the smartest, most
this is 300. Wow, okay.
Yeah, this is 291, so 9 episodes away from 300.
Yeah. That's a feat, man. I know what it's like to do. So to hit 300 is quite an accomplishment.
I started back in October of 2021. I used to do 3 episodes a week, but between working a full-time job, playing in a band, and all that other stuff, it starts to get a little bit cumbersome on your life. So,
you said 3 books that. Oh man, that's a tough one. Maybe
go to 5 if need be.
No, I mean, like, well, my worldview, like religiously or like specific topics.
Perhaps more like the last half hour of kind of, I don't want to say just philosophy, because I feel like we kind of covered more than philosophy, but like when it comes to like skepticism, empiricism, pre-enlightenment, post-enlightenment, kind of like the ideas of how we come to our beliefs and morals. It would be a couple books that you would recommend people read, because I'm going to get those books.
Ultimate Proof by Dr. Jason Lisle, L-I-S-L-E. That's a good presentation of the transcendental argument in a very readable, accessible form. It's about maybe 250 pages. A good critique of modernity from an Orthodox perspective is Nihilism, Roots of the Modern Revolution by Father Seraphim Rose.
Oh, it's funny.
You got that?
Well, a friend of mine sent me that.
Okay. Yeah, that one's more kind of hitting you on a personal level.
Sure.
And then
just when you mentioned Seraphim Rose, you said it's nihilism.
Is more, but yeah, it's like a philosophical critique of modernity. That one's good.
Sure.
One more. Let me think. Maybe Reflections of a Russian Statesman might be good, just as a challenge to the libertarian ideas.
Okay. Maybe I got that one written down earlier.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Wow. So this has probably been one of the most difficult conversations I thought it was going to be that I've ever had on this podcast, and I'm very, very thankful for.
Hey man, I'd much rather drill into like these kinds of topics than like, what do you think about Donald Trump? What do you think about Elon Musk? Like that just gets so old. So I'd much rather talk about this. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I like to get the more meta of it, because like you said, I find like the mundane political topics to be so boring, but I'd rather talk about like the cause and effect, and then kind of like how people are talking about it, and like why they're talking about it, and why they feel the way they do. Like that stuff's way more interesting.
Yeah, we need to have more conversations like that Paul Davies' Mind of God book. That's a fascinating book. I talked about that book quite a bit, like 7 years ago. I need to kind of resurrect that book because it's really good, and I haven't really covered that in 7 or 8 years. So that one you'll find really fascinating. I think you'll really like that book.
Paul Davies' Mind of God.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's I forget what he is, but he's basically looking at like mathematics and there's a chapter on Mandelbrot sets. There's a chapter on Roger Penrose and various mathematicians who came to kind of see the impossibility of materialism and what math shows us. So it's a lot of stuff like that, that basically mathematics shows that there's got to be some sort of divine mind that's underlying everything.
Sure. Okay, so I'm definitely picking that one up then. Yeah, I got quite a bit of reading in front of me now. Jay, go ahead and give your plugs, brother. I sincerely appreciate your time so much.
No, it was a great conversation. I appreciate you handling it in a very civil way when there's disagreement. A lot of times people can't. They get, emotional and they're all upset.
You are way smarter than me on all this stuff, so I will gladly cede you the ground and just listen, because this is I'm very open to changing my mind on any of this stuff, and I try to be as open-minded as possible so that way I can receive new information, hopefully improve my life.
Yeah, ideally that's exactly how we should be. Yeah, so you can go to jaysanalysis.com, and everything that I do is always there at that centralized website. I have a members section, which goes back almost 8 or 9 years now of content of lectures. We got a philosophy course I did with Richard Grove, which is separate from my website, but I've got lectures through like Plato's Republic and some of the dialogues. I've got full lectures through Tragedy and Hope. We got a lot of geopolitical content summarizing 50 or so writings of the elite of the last 100 years. We got a lot of interviews that we've done for the last 10 years over there. So yeah, that's at Jay's Analysis. It's $4.95 a month, $60 a year. I've got 3 books on the website. You can get signed copies in the shop. My wife also has a couple books there. She writes on similar topics to me, a lot of Hollywood symbolism, that kind of stuff. Every Friday, 4th hour of Alex Jones. And then we will be live in Los Angeles, March 15th with Jamie Kennedy, doing another one of our live events. Our live events are a lot of fun. We do big kind of 5-hour infotainment parties. We have stand-up, we have comedy, we have information like you heard tonight. And it's 5 hours, a lot of fun, book signing. So that's if you're in the Los Angeles area, come out March 15th and see us at that event. And you can find me on Rockfin as well, which is a great free speech-based platform. A lot of my material is over there. That's all I can think of.
Yeah, man. Well, like I said, I really appreciate your time. Every single show I've heard you on, you definitely got me thinking about stuff differently, and then particularly this show as well. I'm going to have to listen over probably 2 or 3 times to make sure I got everything. And I'm going to continue listening to your stuff. I would love to get you back on to talk some geopolitics stuff.
Yeah, anytime.
I think we would have, I don't think there's any disagreements, but I think your analysis would be very, very productive for kind of like the libertarian anti-interventionist, I apologize, perspective. So yeah, Jay, if you have anything else, I'll close her out.
Yeah, I mean, on the libertarian front, Richard Grove and I are good buddies, and we've done a lot of work together for many years. So, I have a lot of interviews with him, and he's interviews with me, and I've been on Grand Theft World a lot. So, we obviously have a lot of affinities with the libertarian sphere, and some disagreements. So I'm always happy to have that conversation with you guys. Maybe not so much Austin Peterson, but I don't think he was very rational, though. He was like super emo, but yeah, man, anytime I'd love to come back and have that conversation.
Nice, man. Well, all right, Jay, thank you so much. We'll hopefully do it again. Everybody, thank you so much for listening. Until next time, take care.
All right, later.